Thank you for joining us today. We have a stellar cast of experts available to walk you through how to reduce patch panic by applying zero trust protection to your application workloads. We're joined by Jim Routh today, transformational security leader and previous CISO at Aetna, JP Morgan, and American Express. As well, Marcelo Oliveira, our Chief Product Officer here at Virsec, will be guiding a roundtable discussion with Jim after the demonstration. Myself, I'm Mark Milankovich. I'm Senior Director of Product Marketing. I report to Marcelo and help with the go-to-market activities. And Matt Ambrosiak is our Solution Architect. Matt will walk us through the technology embedded within Virsec to reduce patch panic, as well as walk through a demonstration of how we protect against Log4j. We've got a great lineup for you. Stay tuned. First, we'll talk about the vulnerabilities, risks, and patching challenges facing so many operators today. And we'll walk into the intention of attackers. Let's get into the mind of them so we know how to prevent them from an infiltration and weaponization perspective. Next, we'll look at how to reduce the effort and fatigue that patching introduces in terms of the organization. And we'll respond to that with an accuracy of security in a proactive security posture. Matt will walk us through the technology of how to avoid panic patching. And Marcelo will lead us into the roundtable with Jim and have an open discussion on all the technology facing us. And now let's take a look at vulnerabilities, risks, and patches and the uphill battle facing security teams today. When we look at the typical attacker that's out there, we really characterize these in terms of nation state and cyber criminal activity. On the left-hand side, when we look at the CISO government report outlining the top CVEs used most by Chinese state-sponsored cyber actors since 2020, what we see is 12 out of the top 20 most significant and critical security violations are remote code execution. In addition to that, when we look over to the right, this gang called Babook, what we see is a number of tools that are currently available in public domain are being leveraged. But in terms of rather than buying logs or looking at different identity theft techniques, the preferred entry is also remote code execution. What we're seeing in both sophisticated attacks by nation state and cyber criminals today, all roads lead to remote code execution. The system is the target. The server workload is the target. When we look at the data breach investigation report done annually by Verizon, what we see is that in terms of the cyber vulnerabilities that are growing, the continued target is servers. And in these servers, internet-facing web applications, the combination of those prove to be the highest value target for cyber criminals today. And this is what we're here to show you how to protect. One of the fundamental issues facing not only DevOps organizations, IT organizations, and security organizations is the issue facing them called patching. Whether this be release methodology or whether it be change management in an ITIL perspective, patching is at the root of so many IT challenges. Most notable is the risk it induces by having open attack surfaces by exposed vulnerabilities that are not being addressed. When we look at security patching on the left-hand side, it directly impacts the resources needed to plan for current business releases of software, applications, and maintenance. It exposes the organization to undue risk due to dwell time. And that is after a vulnerability, a CVE or CWE is actually published, but before a patch is actually available. Your systems are open to these vulnerabilities and bad actors are pouncing on them very quickly. In addition to these use cases, what we also see is that the backlog of patches, the velocity, variety, and impact is actually increasing. As security patches now are a result of over 60% of the vulnerabilities, and even legacy patches over 2 years old are playing a more significant route. And this is impactful because when we look at legacy-based issues related to patching, the alternative, if you're not in extended support, is to pay an exorbitant amount of money. That is 25, then 100, then 125% of the original license fee. This gets to be astronomical at one point. So what we're proposing is a different solution, a solution that takes into account security compensating controls that deliver a proactive security posture to deliver a security backstop for your workloads and server environments that actually protects against 0 days attacks for these host workloads. So when we look at the 5 top patching problems that are underway within the industry today, some of these we've touched on, but we'll dive in just a little bit more. We've touched on the volume and velocity of the vulnerabilities. This relates to a staffing issue. Anecdotally, when I talk to our customers, what I've seen is generally around 40% is a magic number of being able to address the known vulnerabilities. And we talk about this, we're talking about the 21,000 that were actually published last year, of which 8,000 were actually remote code executions. Just the volume and velocity is leaving the resource and staffing needs unattended and unmanageable at this point in time. It cannot solve the problem with human labor. Keeping critical application security, job number 1 for everybody in the organization. If you receive a data breach, this is basically cutting off your customers, your business, and your relationship in the marketplace today. One of the major problems also facing our organizations is the ability to automate application workload protection. With the advent of first-generation technology for whitelisting, now what we see is that the automation of the allow listing technology has brought into bear a much faster organization where you set and forget. The automation is there to give you that proactive security posture with known good processes, libraries, and dependencies at runtime. We've touched on this as well, but the human capital, the number of people that actually need to go through all the scans, all the reports, analyze this, do both correlation off-net as well as in real time with dashboards, but bring it all together for the insights needed to get to root cause. This is getting to be a very expensive operation given the volume of false positives with certain current technologies in place. And top number 5, by certainly not the least impactful, is the reduction of risk until the patch can be deployed. Nothing can add stress to anybody's job more than knowing that a problem is actually in place and that you can't do anything about it. You need that patch from the vendor. How does this all translate into risk? When we look at cyber risk, it's really a simple math combination. What is the likelihood of this event actually occurring times the impact? And when we look at the likelihood of a breach, a large data breach actually happening, there's really 3 factors. The real-time threat, that is of it being exploited. We translate that into a 0-day attack in terms of something you haven't seen before. The exposure of the asset. As we talked about earlier, the breach report is highlighting both servers and web applications as that open attack surface that is being exposing the risk in your environment. And thirdly is whether there's a mitigating control to put in place. The challenge here is that a lot of the current technology with detection and response puts you behind on timing. In a lot of cases, the ransomware and malware have already been exploited, and now you're not into a security situation, you're into a situation of analyzing and reducing the impact of the exploit. And going along with this, when we look at the impact of a breach, it's really the severity. And again, servers are a one-to-many combination, whereas a mobile device or a laptop, a typical endpoint, certainly does give you a level of vulnerability. It's a one-to-one relationship, one person typically to a laptop or a mobile device. A server, on the other hand, is one-to-many, 1 to 1,000, if not more. That's why it's becoming such a high-value target. And when we look at this, it's really the business criticality of the underlying asset. And again, that is why servers, and particularly email and IT and OT are facing servers are of prime target. So where does Virsec help? First off, when we look at the number of challenges that are out there, the first risk that we address is that issued by unpatched software. As we talked about, as this dwell time starts to increase, you're really left with no alternative other than praying, frankly. But with Virsec, what we provide is a bare minimum of host OS, and then you can layer on both memory support and web support for multi-layered full stack support. 0-day attacks are very tricky. Again, most of the technology relies on behavioral analysis and being able to see a pattern and then weed that out. But all that takes time. And in today's world, where 3 seconds basically is the difference between running your business normally and having your data breached and locked down with ransomware encryption. Those 3 seconds are basically define a zero-day attack and the threat of it. And we've touched on the volume and velocity of alerts, but really a lot of this comes from false positives and the way that access all is being issued from certain technologies today leads to that increase in alert volume. And lastly is the patching panic, the ability to both look at segmentation and contain the blast radius of a potential attack, but then to address that. And since in a lot of cases, a vendor patch is not available for root cause, you end up patching sub-portions of the systems or the underlying drivers or looking at different ways to contain the impact of that. That panic patching starts to impact your resources, your already planned business releases. It has a significant effect downstream. So let's take a look at the intention of attackers and what are they trying to accomplish to get into the heads of Babook and nation-state organizations. What we've seen is a general trend towards looking at zero-day vulnerabilities, and predominantly a lot of these come from unpatched vulnerabilities. So let's define what we mean by dwell time, because it's a unit of measure that's critical for this discussion. When we look at a CVE or CWE, a critical vulnerability being published in the normal database, and again, for reference, there was roughly about 21,000 of those issued last year, 8,000 of them being remote code executions. Once that's actually disclosed to the public, the bad actors start to actually look at scans across the internet and look for vulnerable organizations to start to infiltrate and weaponize. Within there, until the patch is actually released and the organization can actually deploy it to quell the root cause of that security problem, all of that is related to dwell time and can start to look at in excess of 60, if not 200 days in many different situations. So protecting the application while there's no patches available is extremely hard problem to define, and one that Virsec is willing to step up and deliver. So if you take a look at your organization and you run a scan across it, what you'll see is that there's a number of vulnerabilities that basically play out as open attack vectors within your organization. Some of those may be unpatched vulnerabilities, ones you just simply haven't got around to or aren't critical enough to actually address. Other of them might be vulnerabilities from a systems perspective, whether it be an API or other connection, or coming through in terms of the logic of your web application through different attacks from the internet. And another example would be legacy environments no longer available with patches or out of support or extended support operations, which starts to become a growing concern as we start to see Windows 2003, 2008, we start to see CentOS 6.5, 7, etc., start to be laggards in terms of that support organization. Being able to protect these open vulnerabilities is key to protecting your organization and reducing risk. So when we look at the mindset of an attacker, first off is number one, number two for a number of years have been identity and access management correlated by networks. And we start to look at the pillars for a zero trust architecture. The one that we start to look at is the application workloads. But as a flow of an attacker, what we start to look at is the penetration of various firewalls, going through segmentation, being able to infiltrate and weaponize various vulnerabilities that have been identified. This is all pre-execution. Bad actors can then start to look at the application workload and start to look at bypass techniques, whether it be dynamic link libraries and injecting different code bases inside of there, looking at buffer overflow errors, starting to translate in terms of different memory injections. All of that starts to look at runtime. When we look at remote code executions and start to look at different techniques to look at lateral movements across different systems, we start to see that the problem becomes very extensive. So what can we do today to reduce the effort and fatigue? And particularly what we want to focus in on is the accuracy of your security system. So when we look at reducing panic patching overall, what we see is that in terms of the price of the organization, what we see in blue here is normal operation. You're starting to get patching information from your applications, your operating systems, your frameworks, and these are normal patches that happen and are regularly serviced from an automation perspective. And then along comes the red. And in the red is a high critical security patch that must be put in place. Otherwise, business operations will grind to a halt. Being able to introduce this workflow asynchronously and start to inject different priorities versus the planned priorities is unnatural stress from an organization. We can start to see some unknown impacts, such as, has this actually been tested with all the different types of device drivers outside of there? How we start to look at what the impact is of certain downloads in low bandwidth regions. All of those impacts in terms of deploying the patch as a presumed solution for it become problematic as you start to panic patching just to start to alleviate the blast radius and contain the impact to the organization. Much like the Colonial pipeline attack, shut down the OT side so it doesn't start to affect the IT side of it from a lateral movement perspective. So to do that, what we see is that one of the key technologies that is available today from Virsec is the ability to stop the exploitation of these vulnerabilities with host protection. As a multi-layered approach, this is an additive approach to look at your servers, provide the automated capability to provide the provenance of your dependencies from a library, process perspective and dependencies, and make sure that everything that's running in runtime is certified and has a signature from a known reputed database. With that as a backstop, what we see is that a lot of the exploits no longer have any impact as you've protected the operating system and the application workload inside of there at runtime with known good authorized processes, files, libraries, and dependencies. The impact to this is really on how you migrate to a protection model. Again, rather than looking at detection and response capabilities that put you behind on timing and the resources needed to do the scan analysis, all the false positives, the impact of breaches after the fact, protection is really a game changer. From that standpoint, we see that the number of value drivers include operational efficiencies, reducing the amount of impact to the SOC and the IT organizations for false positives, reduce the cost of an impact the breach would actually have, and certainly cost avoidance of any ransomware. But equally so, when we start to look at zero trust protection for application workloads, we could start to look at tools consolidation for that zero trust pillar of application workloads and start to reduce the overall license and configuration time needed for those environments. So with that, what I'm going to do is turn it over to Matt, and he'll walk you through the technology to avoid panic patching. Thank you.
So now we want to move a little bit further along and talk about how we can avoid panic patching in the first place. And the first step would, of course, be to block exploits up front. We want to reduce dwell time of attackers to absolutely zero. We want to receive alerts, and those alerts should trigger automation of patching workflows, ideally. So the idea here is if you are protected in runtime, meaning an attacker cannot exploit, there is no reason to panic. Critical and high severity patches are usually our first priority in our patch cycles. When exploits are blocked, we have time to patch on our terms, right? And we can bump the patches to the top of the list, which have vulnerabilities we already know are actively being attacked by our bad actors out there. So we have to protect our entry points to avoid panic patching. And that's the key here. In order to understand how to protect our entry points, we've got to dig into what is really happening under the hood. And we'll discuss technology to protect web applications with interpreted code such as Java and .NET, then the memory layer or compiled executables, like code applications, which are exposed. Services such as web servers, SSH, RDP, etc. So protecting web applications. So the first entry point is web apps and interpreted code, right? In this space, we traditionally have our RASP and WAF tools. And the trick is selecting a technology that does not require a lengthy learning period or manual training. Security products that live on the wire have primary visibility into the HTTP request payload. And WAFs must learn this business logic of our apps, which, I'm sure some of you may already know this pain. And beyond that, a security tool should not need to be baked into the code. Instead, a tool can live inside the web framework, as Virsec does, alongside the application, as an additional class in the application at runtime. And that's very lightweight. In this model, there is a very small price to pay in response time. Nothing is for free after all, but this will make vulnerabilities useless to the attacker. And that's because here, security tools can protect. If there is an attempt to drop a SQL table, as an example, it should be detected and blocked before it actually happens. If you were alerted after the fact, that would not be very helpful. So we're going to look at a simple example of a SQL injection. And generally speaking, if you have access to the business logic, it's easy to identify inside the code interpreter when that business logic has been compromised before execution. So living inside the web framework, we would have visibility into user input in the HTTP request. But inherently, we also have visibility into the business logic without any learning period. The moment that application loads, we can start doing side-by-side comparisons of what the business logic looked like before user input, and knowing what that user input is, and understanding when user input impacts the business logic on the other side of the equation. So what happens here, let's just say a user input comes in and it happens to have some SQL injection in it. And we identify that not only is there an attempt to breach into the other code interpreter, but that attempt actually would have been successful. Meaning not only was there SQL verbs in that request, but those SQL verbs turn into something that was completely valid and the SQL interpreter would have happily executed. And because we know that the SQL interpreter would have happily executed such code, that's categorized as an attack, and it's actually blocked before it happened in the first place. Now, if you change that story a little bit, where the attacker attempts to breach into a code interpreter, yet that attempt falls short, maybe they're missing a semicolon or a dash or whatever. Let's just say the syntax is incorrect. And because the syntax is incorrect, that would not have been a successful attack because the code interpreter would have rejected it. Although we see, let's just say we see some SQL verbs arriving. That's categorized as a threat, and you get an alert around that as well. Now, the attacker is not successful. We have an alert around it, but there's nothing to block per se because the attacker wasn't going to be successful. Now, take that a step further. The attacker is maybe not a very good hacker to begin with. Maybe it's so far from being something recognizable as a SQL injection that it doesn't even matter. Well, that's benign, right? There's no SQL verbs and nothing of the like. So anything less than being something that would have breached into the SQL interpreter is going to be categorized as benign in these cases. And then we have an example of how to protect application memory at runtime. So protecting our apps in memory is another common entry point. And so let's just get into how we can protect our compiled code at runtime. Again, these are applications like the web servers themselves and other exposed services on the network. We want to ensure an attacker cannot execute a buffer overflow attack and start running their own instructions from memory. A couple of products have managed to do something like this, but some unfortunately require the recompilation of code, as in the case of Microsoft. Other products have been heavy-handed in doing things like modifying name memory or using memory obfuscation techniques. The magic is that Virsec does not require recompilation. It does not impact your startup configuration, and it protects immediately after load times. And this allows you to protect memory and get alerts when attacks happen and killing malicious threads immediately. So let me explain. So of course, if executable loads, any good security program will have some file integrity checking before executing, of course. But once that load time happens, memory addresses are assigned as code loads into memory. So now all those memory locations of that binary are delivered to Virsec as a Virsec map. And this is called a buffer overflow map. And this does not require source code at all, or any baking, as I already mentioned. And we just monitor execution at every memory transition. So right before these jumps in memory occur, there's a validation step that happens, and it's extremely fast. So when we have a vulnerability, let's just say a vulnerability at code block 300 in this example, we see our buffer overflow map here on the right-hand side. And we know that the source of 368, code block 368, can only jump to code block 400. In this case, we see a jump to code block 500, or whatever the case may be. This very plainly is a deviation from this buffer overflow map. And we can very easily say, hey, this is an attack. This application is never supposed to do this. And yes, some applications, when they load from disk into memory, they may randomize their memory locations. We have native operating system tools like ASLR, which some may be familiar with, which they do this for you. Whatever the methodology is to randomize these locations is, the fact of the matter is, once they do load, they're fixed. For that particular load time, they're fixed. And for the duration of this process, we know what this map looks like and very easily can identify when these jumps in memory happen, and thereby being able to protect and kill these malicious threads right away. So left unprotected, all roads lead to remote code execution, right? And this speaks to the host operating system protection. So if we were to ignore the first two layers, and this leaves our hosts wide open, so what the attacker at that point is now transitioning to running code at the operating system level. So often this is where EDR solutions fall short, as they're looking for behavior and patterns. And for all components on a workload, we should follow a chain of trust, as we do with Virsec, using digital signatures. And this can be done by decomposing packages and extracting checksums. If you can lock down the process and libraries allowed through allow listing, in this case, if you were to have something like a supply chain attack, right? If someone were to take advantage of a backdoor in your system, meanwhile, it could be even digitally signed code. It wouldn't matter, actually, because the attacker would have to deviate from the allowed runtime operations of that particular workload. So yes, that backdoor is there, but it becomes useless because in order for the attacker to further their intent, they have to start, maybe using whatever tools available to download additional binary scripts or whatever it may be, or running particular binaries with parameter usages which have never been seen before. Whatever the case is, they're going to deviate from what is known good on that operating system, on that host, and they're going to trigger an incident, and they're going to get blocked. They're going to get protected, or the workload will be protected. So to protect a workload, you first need to deploy a probe package. So now we're discussing how this whole onboarding process works. That probe instruments 3 layers once deployed on a workload, and it does so independently in those 3 layers and receives and enforces policies defined in a centralized system. Once a workload is onboarded and communicating with this central system, it can immediately associate itself with workload profiles, which allow for immediate protection without any learning periods at all. For example, when an application loads, or a web application that is, Virsec classes load alongside with it without any code modifications, and monitoring for any deviations from the business logic of that application. When discussing binaries, we can protect binaries at load time. And when that happens, a memory map is created and validated in the runtime. And to protect a host, a one-time scan is completed for all components, scanning the disk. And when that takes place, that profile can be associated with workloads of the same type. So those components can be analyzed to verify reputation through several methods to understand their dependencies and whether or not they're safe. Once a workload is deployed with a Virsec probe, zero trust execution is automated, working across the full stack to protect your web application, memory, and host operating system. So looking at the workload protection controls on the right-hand side of this graphic, it goes into detail how we actually can enforce our protection. So we can enforce what can run, we can enforce how it can run, we can enforce system integrity, we can also protect authorized processes from code injection, we can protect vulnerable code from buffer overflow exploits, and also protect web application from OS vulnerability exploits. So also, this has been battle tested out there in the wild, this application workload protection. It was in the spring of 2021, the US Department of Defense conducted extensive tests against our platform. They brought in the platform, we set it up, we left. There was no curtain for us to hide behind. They brought in 218 of some of the industry's best hackers. Most of them came from the US Department of Defense, intelligence communities, and the Department of Homeland Security. And many of these individuals were NSA, Red Team certified. That is, they were extremely gifted, talented, ethical hackers, let's just say. So the paradigm is something you're familiar with, I'm sure. The hacking event was where these individuals broke themselves up into teams and competed against each other to see who could break Virsec the most. After 1 week and nearly 14,500 different attempts, from remote code execution to wild stuff that came out of the intelligence communities that no one had ever seen before, to the persistent attacks that they attempted, they were not able to exploit Virsec one time. Virsec scored 100% in this exercise that was run, and the collective adversaries scored 0%. So now this had reverberating effects throughout the US Department of Defense, our Five Eyes partners, as well as private industry. So because of this impact, most individuals that attempt these things have never seen a perfect score. Before we actually dive into the actual platform, let's dissect this a little bit for us here. Now, in this particular case, the attacker is going to run a script. You'll see me run this script, which is going to do a series of things such as checking that a web server is up and indeed that it is vulnerable to log4j via file inclusion attempt. They're going to go through a series of events, ultimately doing whatever they want to do. In this case, they actually have the intention to detonate some ransomware. But even when they detonate ransomware, they're going to have a control center where they can get a reverse shell and have a command prompt and do other nasty things that they want to do. So up front, the attacker is exploiting log4j through remote file inclusion. However, the last step of the attack is going to be when they detonate the ransomware, or it's kind of open-ended, right? They can detonate the ransomware and then do other things, but ransomware, most attackers will just detonate that ransomware, get out and wait for their Bitcoin to arrive or whatever it may be. So we're gonna break this down in the demonstration and see actually how this plays out. What happens when we block everything up front? What happens when we stand down at particular layers in terms of turning off protection at, say, the web layer and show protection at the host layer, or maybe when we just turn all protection off and we just detect and show all the visibility that we may have, right? So that's an idea of what we're going to be seeing in just a moment. So I'm going to break from the slide presentation now, and we're going to pivot over to the product demonstration. All right. So this is the Virsec security platform. In particular, this is the central monitoring system. This is a dashboard that gives us some insights on some things that have been going on in our environment over a period of time. Generally speaking, this looks pretty good. So let's review our applications. We're interested in the Struts application, which is vulnerable to log4j. In our demo environment, we have this Apache Struts one-page photo solutions application. You'll see that it's in a normal state, which means it's instrumented with the Virsec probe, it's online, and it's being accessed, right? And we have our probes. Probes are the software deployed on the workload. This lets us know that we're connected and communicating as well. And currently, we are in a detect mode at the host layer. We're going to switch that. We're going to set the host layer to be in a protect mode. As it is right now, the web application layer is already in a protect mode. We'll see a little bit more of that later. So as it stands, what we're seeing is our host in a protect mode, the operating system, as well as the web application layer. This particular demo doesn't address buffer overflow attacks, but we'll be focusing on the web application and host layers at this particular time. The incidents list is where we rebuild the attack kill chain. Fortunately, there's nothing in here right now. So we're going to review this in just a moment when we see what the attacker has been up to following these scripts that we'll be running, which is going to exploit the log4j vulnerability. My workload is here. This is my Windows Server 2012 server, which is running Apache Struts. This is the logs which are running on by. And this is the attacker's box, if you will. So when I'm in this particular screen, just remember that this is the view of the attacker. I'm doing some reconnaissance. I'm checking out the website associated with this service. right? I'm just curious. And then I'm going to make an attempt to exploit log4j. At this point, I don't just assume I don't know anything. I'm going to run my scripts to see if it's vulnerable or not. And I see that the web server is up. I do a quick validation of the log4j vulnerability, and I see that, ooh, indeed, the target is affected. And at this point, I'm going to blindly continue. I see that it's vulnerable to log4j, so I'll go ahead and go about my business here. I'm not really sure whether I'm going to be successful yet. But then when the attacker attempts to start firing up their own HTTP server, they're expecting the website to be defaced. Ultimately, they're expecting the ransomware to be detonated, but they're doing some initial validations to see how far they're getting. But unfortunately, they're not getting the result they're looking for. And if we look at the server itself, this is the server that they're attacking, everything looks pretty good here. Returning to the Virsec platform, the central monitoring system, we now see that we have two events. We have the log event for remote file inclusion, right? We see the attacker's IP address. But as I mentioned earlier, when something is just a threat, meaning we see a malicious payload come in, but we don't actually see that they received a response, we log it. We let you know that there's a threat coming in and someone's trying to exploit something, but not yet successful. However, this time around, we see a block event, and that's because that's when they actually would have received a response from the server. But we blocked it before they actually did, and the server remains safe. They're unable to exploit log4j. And at this point, there's nothing really more for the attacker to do. There's no prior knowledge of this. All we see is this remote file inclusion come in. This is not a valid operation for this particular web application, and therefore it's blocked. And so we can change the story a little bit. So now that we blocked with the web layer, we can see how this is different. And we want to change our protection level at the web layer. I want to take my Java application, and normally this would always be in a protected state, but this is a demonstration, right? So I happen to know that remote file inclusion is coming my way. So I'm just going to set that to detect. I'm going to update this. I want to protect against remote. I want to stand down for remote file inclusions. I just want to detect it. I don't want to do anything in terms of protection. But I did leave host protection enabled. We're still enabled for protection at the host layer. So now, if we just rerun that attack, exactly as we did before. Now, what the attacker attempts to do is once he gets past the web layer, the next attempt is to download a PowerShell script and start executing it, right? So what we're expecting is some sort of incident around PowerShell to be detected. So, of course, same as before, web server's up, web server is vulnerable. The attacker attempts to proceed with the vulnerability, but unfortunately for them, when they start serving out this exploit.class file, because they did get a little bit further, they fired up an HTTP server and was able to do so. And then they try to run that PowerShell script. But again, they're not getting the result they expect. And then we see in the logs here on the actual server they're attacking, we see access denied. Virsec saw something attempt to get loaded to memory, but we denied them. But guess what? The web service is still up and running. The rest of the users are not impacted, just a particular user who is initiating such an attack. And we have a little bit different story now in the list of incidents. Of course, the attacker was able to successfully get past the web layer. We see that this attack came in, but the difference is we stood down, we just said detect only, and we logged the event. But we have another layer of protection here as a backstop. When the attacker actually goes to execute that PowerShell, they're downloading this E1PS1 script, and that's what does all these nasty things like deface the website, change the desktop background to skull and crossbones, detonate ransomware, whatever the case is. This is where they're blocked, and again, unable to proceed. Otherwise, we would have all these other additional events, file integrity tickets and such, but the attacker stops here. They're unable to proceed, and again, they're frustrated, and there's nothing more that they can do. So that what you saw was web protection. We had web protection not turned on, and we blocked the attacker at the front door, if you will. Then we turned the protection mode to detect for the web layer, allowed all those incidents to get logged without stepping in and doing something about it. And that's when we engaged the host layer protection to block the living off the land style attacks. And by the way, we had these application control policies. Now, of course, things like PowerShell as you might have thought of, are signed by Microsoft, but that's why we put application control policies in place, which put guardrails around these very dangerous tools that exist on an operating system, which may be preloaded by the victim. So we have multiple layers of protection and tools which ensure that workloads always maintain what they're intended to do by their creators, and anything else that deviates from those intentions are then blocked at some point in the kill chain. All right, with that, we're going to return back to the presentation and switch over to the roundtable with Jim Routh.
Thank you so much, Matt. That was great. So folks, what we're going to do right now is we're going to have a series of 3 survey questions just to get some feedback from the audience here. And what we'll do is we'll acknowledge the responses for each one of the questions, and then we'll open it up to a roundtable discussion with Jim and Marcelo. Let's start with the first question. What percentage of known vulnerabilities does your organization patch every quarter? So in terms of this is fascinating. We've got quite a range here, 20 to 40%, about 33% of the respondents. The highest answer is about 50% with unsure. But for those that did reply, 21 to 40% is an interesting number. That's actually in line with what we see with a lot of our customers. And the 41 to 60%, fantastic. Congratulations, being able to close that off. Let's take a look at the next question, and we'll address this as a topic in just a few minutes. So for question number 2, do you feel the practices and tools you currently have in place will adequately protect your application workloads? The vast majority of answered questions is no, that don't feel that the adequate protection is in place. Interesting. And let's go to the third question before we open it up to the roundtable here. Question number 3, and then we'll get into it. Do you currently have mitigating controls to protect your vulnerable application workloads? Evenly split. Interesting. Yes, no, and unsure what it is. That's good feedback. So with this as a backdrop, let's open it up to Marcelo and Jim and start the dialogue around the advent of patching vulnerabilities and how the world can be a little bit more secure place.
All right, thanks, Mark. Thanks, Matt. Great session. Good job, guys. And Jim, thank you so much for taking the time and spending the time here with us on this session. You've been a CISO for many years, like in some of the most sophisticated companies from a cybersecurity perspective, Jim, like from JP Morgan to Amex, etc. Like they are what I call the gold standard, right? From cybersecurity in general. And over the years, you had the opportunity to really look at the evolution of the cybersecurity market. And I would love to hear your opinion on how bad it is out there. What are you hearing from your colleagues and the folks in the industry, the security practitioners, the leaders, the CISOs? Because when we go to customers and we're engaging with our customers today, customers keep talking about they're overwhelmed. Like, right, we've seen some of the poll results here about the volume, like being able to patch between 20 and 40% of your vulnerabilities in a given quarter. It just means that it's getting worse, right? It's just not getting better. So I'd like to put to you, like, just to speak to us a little bit about the trends and what are you seeing out there?
Yeah, so first of all, my experience, and I work for large companies primarily, but the larger the enterprise, the more likely there were a larger number of vulnerabilities and a larger percentage of devices impacted by vulnerabilities. And you might say, well, wait, a large organization, they're sophisticated. They're spending a lot of money, like billions of dollars in some cases, on cybersecurity and IT hygiene. And that's absolutely true. But in a larger enterprise, there's more going on. There's more changes to infrastructure. There's more changes to business processes. There's with the greater complexity and scope of change, it becomes more difficult to run a stable IT environment because the practices that are really good IT hygiene practices, they're difficult to scale. Now, fortunately, enterprise tools for automation have improved. So specifically on the workstation side, in terms of endpoint protection and deploying patches to endpoints, we've got a lot of automation around that, and so that's really helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Server sides, we're dealing with applications, and again, I work with highly talented, highly skilled, both IT professionals and cybersecurity professionals, and the reality is that applications, some of which are old enough to vote, still permeate in the enterprise, and those applications are brittle because they were developed under different constructs 20 years ago. So the brittleness of the application impacts the ability to patch, and so what happens is you patch those devices where you have a lot of automation that you can deploy, and you typically do that first. And the others, you try to hold off and surround and try to, put manual, labor-intensive kind of protection in place. Well, what's happened is, and cybersecurity is all about trends. We all recognize that. Frankly, we don't set the trends, we follow them. The threat actors are the ones that really set the trends, so we have to respond to that. So what's happening is when you have things like Log4j, just as an example, you're in a situation where you have a critical patching need. Now, critical from an order of severity, it's the highest level of severity. What does that mean? It means that there's remote code execution availability, and typically that exploit is already been compromised in the wild. In other words, criminals are using it today in the enterprise. And then as a result, your enterprise and your attack surface, which is growing by leaps and bounds with new complexity and new challenge with cloud computing and other types of IT transformational initiatives, your key resources that are enabling of the business benefits associated with deploying and managing technology, all of a sudden have to pull back and say, well, how do we patch in this critical mode? Because we have to do it in a matter of hours as opposed to weeks or months, which is our normal patching cycle. And so it's really all hands on deck to try to do that. Well, that causes a lot of disruption in people's lives. So you're working weekends and nights to try to deal with the critical patching situation, and none of that work was planned. It was all unplanned. And of course, who's doing that work? Server administrators are doing that work, and system administrators, and frankly, some of your best cybersecurity operational support resources and engineers are lending their help in dealing with extraordinary circumstances of critical patching. So if that were to happen once a year, maybe, you could budget some little cushion somewhere to deal with the impact of that. But what's happening today is this is happening on a monthly basis. It's not because the sophistication in terms of the threat actor tactics, it's using more 0 days. We're seeing this much more frequently. And then you combat that, or you add to that the supply chain, the software supply chain that's been compromised or being compromised somewhere in the cycle. And again, the larger the enterprise, the larger the attack surface, the more likely you're going to be impacted by poisoning of the software supply chain. So that's happening more frequently. Well, it's having an impact on your most critical IT and cybersecurity resource. And it's not sustainable. This whole patch cycle, you can have top-notch automation, you can have top-notch talent, you can have unlimited budget. Physically, it is challenging at best to deal with critical patching cycles. And with the frequency of those cycles increasing, it's not a sustainable model. Something's going to break, and that's going to have business impact. And that's kind of where we are today, Marcelo.
Okay, so it basically defies the dimensions of time and space a little bit, right? Like it's not about money. It's about just there's not enough hours in the day to attack this. And so this was going to lead me to the second question is what are people doing about this, right? It felt to me, Jim, from your answer here is it's mostly reactive, right? Waiting for things to happen, and then it's all hands on deck, no weekends, right? I was talking to another CISO, one of our customers, when Log4j actually hit, right? And she said, wow, I could have brunch in the weekend, right? Because I knew that I could patch on my own terms. So how is there anything else? Is there any other promise? Do you think it's just going to keep getting worse?
Well, I know when I was in an active CISO role, and I started to deal with this dilemma, it's nowhere near the scale it is at this point in time, but I'm going back maybe 2 or 3 years. And I know I could tell from just the trend lines that this was an unsustainable model. Like I couldn't even budget for this or deal with the costs associated with this. And so I recognized that I had to do something else. Now, granted, in some of the companies that I work for, the IT hygiene, so that's the deployment of technology, the understanding of the asset inventory associated with what's deployed, the vulnerability management for that infrastructure, and the ongoing management on a day-to-day basis for both deploying and managing change. All of that in some of my companies was the most sophisticated and mature that I'd ever experienced in my career. And so these were really top-notch, talented people that focused on improving the whole cycle of deploying technology effectively and then managing the change process associated with that to be both effective and efficient at the same time. And even in those certain cases, critical patching still required top talent to work round the clock to deal with that. And I can tell you with absolute certainty that when that occurred, those events occurred, there were business priorities that were being deprioritized as a result of that. And there were, deployment programs and projects that were being postponed as a result of that. And it had a huge impact on the people. And so recognizing the trend, I decided to invest time and effort in coming up with different potential approaches that could be considered. Because I recognize that even with mature IT hygiene capability, which is not the norm, it's frankly the exception in most enterprises, but even with that, this was not a sustainable model. And so I investigated and looked at emerging technology in something that today is categorized as workload runtime protection. And the industry had some capability in the RASP category that kind of fit and had potential. The short story is that that category of technology was promising but not deployable. What do I mean by that? I meant that it wasn't ready for production time in an enterprise because it was too labor intensive to tune and adjust it to deal with the vagaries of and diversity of application capability and functionality. It just wasn't automated enough or mature enough. It had promise. There were certainly opportunities there, but it really wasn't necessarily scalable at that time. But it warrants every enterprise, I think, today, given the patterns and the trends that we're looking at, you got to invest in looking at some alternative capability in workload runtime protection. It's absolutely essential because to the degree that you can deploy that capability, even in some subset of your enterprise, you're insulating your most critical resources from the labor intensity of dealing with critical patching.
Exactly.
And that's a better utilization of resource than following the trend.
Major ROI. Yeah, exactly. No, Jim, this is great. And I think for the attendees of this session today, I think if you guys are curious, right? Like we've been engaging with customers. We are all about runtime protection, Jim, as you know, right? Like that's our cloud, our workload protection is second to none. And if you want to see live how we can do 3-4 times better than an EDR, right? Like in stopping any runtime type of attack, or how we can stop ransomware better than anybody else, how we can stop malware better than anybody else. Because what we're basically doing here is we're enforcing the SBOM of the workload. We're making sure that SBOM cannot be attacked, that it cannot be compromised. And that gives us an unfair advantage, against a lot of the other solutions that are in the market today. So if you're looking to really prevent the breach, Virsec is here to help you. I think, Mark, you're going to show here a website where people can, a few links where people can learn more from us. And Jim, I really appreciate you diving deep into this. I think we're running out of time here, but I wanted to thank everyone here for joining us today and for a great session. And let us know if you have any questions.
Thanks, Marcelo.
Thanks, Jim. Appreciate it.